For today's lecture, the first in the series, we welcome very warmly Delphine Orvilleur. She will present a letter from Gershom Scholem to Franz Rosenzweig from 1926 and illuminate it in the current political context. Dear Delphine, I'm delighted that you have accepted our invitation. Over the next few months, Moshe Sakal will talk about Magnus Hirschfeld, Yael Kupferberg will present texts of Max Horkheimer, and Eva Illouz will lecture about Jean Améry. A déjà vu experience can be as uncanny as it is enlightening. Why does the apocalyptic warning in Scholem's letter resonate with us today, 100 years later? And why do Jean Améry's texts from the 1970s help us today, 50 years later, to understand contemporary anti-Semitism? What does it mean to read texts by Max Horkheimer or Magnus Hirschfeld after 1945, or again today after October 7th? What historical experiences do they invoke? In our world today, it seems that questions and uncertainties about Jewish life in Germany and Europe that we believed we had overcome are rising to the fore of our public consciousness again. Questions about migration, about life in the diaspora, about Zionism, about particularism and universalism are present again. As authoritarian power structures, ideological mechanisms, and religious traditions are entering the present day again, sometimes in violent forms, we are compelled to ask these questions from a different perspective, to set off on a new search for old answers. We are delighted that Ofer Waldman will be hosting this digital lecture series. He holds a joint doctorate in history and German literature and is the author of books and radio plays. His first book, Singularkollektiv Erzählungen, was published by Wallstein Verlag in 2023. In 2024, Ofer Waldman and Sascha Marianne Salzman published their correspondence about the world after October 7, 2023, with the title Gleichzeit. In 2021, Ofer Waldman was awarded the German Radio Play Prize of the German television channel ARD for the production Adolf Eichmann, Ein Hörprozess. From August this year, he will be director of the Heinrich Böll Foundation's office in Tel Aviv. How do we proceed tonight? Ofer Waldman will introduce Delphine Orvilleur. You will then hear her 25-minute presentation, which will be followed by a discussion with Ofer Waldman. You will then have the opportunity to ask questions during the Q&A session. Before we begin, I would like to thank my colleagues from the Academy, Daniel Wildman, Sinja Rosbach, Maria Röger, Katja Vatke, Anna Pohlmann, and Juliane Ganser from Event Manager for organizing this evening. Finally, I would like to express my heartfelt thanks to the Bertolt Leibinger Stiftung, which has shared a close bond with the museum over many years. Its generous support makes the digital lecture series possible, and for that, too, I'm truly grateful. It's a pleasure to welcome Mr. Wehner here tonight, representing the Bertolt Leibinger Stiftung. Dear Delphine Orvilleur, dear Ofer Waldman, I'm very pleased to be in this virtual space with you today. Dear Ofer, over to you.
Thank you very much, dear Hattie Berg, for this kind introduction. Dear Delphine Orvilleur, dear staff of the Jewish Museum and Academy, dear audience. The problem was not what our enemies did, but rather what our friends did. Who doesn't know this iconic sentence by Hannah Arendt from the year 1964, referring to the time around 1933 in Germany? But this sentence, this capture of a single historic moment is applicable, is translatable to so many moments in history, Jewish and general alike. We are not or shouldn't be surprised by our enemies, as Arendt says. those who don't share our perception of the human or our sense of humanity or the obligations deriving from this sense. It is more important to look at what our friends do, those with whom we do share a common sense of humanity, and what the friends of our friends do or fail to do, hence ourselves. Delphine Orvilleur asked a few weeks ago in an article which resonated across the Jewish world and beyond, why are we silent? Do we try to protect our ideas, our children? What obligations do we have by being silent or by speaking up, by using or unusing language? Dear audience, I am honored to welcome you to the first lecture of the new digital lecture series of the Jewish Museum in Berlin, Déjà Vu, which I will be hosting over the next 6 months, which will do exactly this, a new search of old answers. We will read and revisit again Jewish scholars and intellectuals from the past 150 years. We will try to find ideas, answers, resonating wounded periods of Jewish and general history in our own wounded time. A time following October 7th, a time of an ongoing war and human-made human catastrophes. And I'm very much privileged to welcome Delphine Orvilleur, a rabbi, a humanist, a writer, as my first guest to this series. Born 1974 in France, Delphine Orvilleur served as a France 2 journalist in Jerusalem before moving to New York, where she studied and was ordinated a rabbi in the Rabbinical Seminary of the Hebrew Union College. She then assumed a leading role in the liberal Jewish community in France, serving as managing editor of its main publication, Tenua. Delphine Orvilleur is one of the founding members of Kerem, the Council of French-speaking liberal rabbis, and has published several books translated to many languages, some of them becoming bestsellers in France and beyond. And maybe for today's context, I will mention two of those books, also available in German and in Hebrew, by the way. Living with Our Dead, Stories of Loss and Consolation, and How Isn't It Going? Conversations Following October 7th. And this last book I mentioned, How Isn't It Going? Conversations Following October 7th, Delphine Orvilleur opens with a poem by the Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish, Fakir Birayrak, Think About the Other, suggesting that poetry can translate us, can carry us beyond from our identity, perspective, country, and time. That poetry can defy the linkage between a language and a place. She then continues and talks about Yiddish, the language of those who have no place, asking if the experience of October 7th catapulted Israel back to a wounded, to a Jewish uprooted state. If October 7th marks a withdrawal from a Hebrew to a Yiddish expressed condition. And today, Delphine Orvilleur invites us to read together a text by Gershom Scholem, the famous German-born Kabbalah scholar, a text from the year 1926, where Scholem, already in Palestine, writes to his friend Franz Rosenzweig, and I quote, Hebrew is pregnant with catastrophes, and then asks, if we transmit to our children the Hebrew language that was transmitted to us, if we, the generation of transition, resuscitate the language of the ancient books so that it can reveal itself anew to them, must then not the religious violence of this language one day break out against those who speak it? And on the day this eruption occurs, which generation will suffer its effects? End of quote. Well, which generation indeed, we ask 100 years later? What is the link between the language and the place in which it is being spoken? Between language and violence? Between speaking up and being silent? Before I hand over to you, dear Delphine, I just want to tell our audience you can use the subtitle option or translation of Teams. You see these three dots, then you can click them and hit on further, Sprache, language, Untertitel, subtitle, and then you have there the options of translating if you click this little wheel, this Rädchen of Übersetzung, translation. So following the presentation of Delphine, where I will also read the text that Delphine Orvilleur has brought us, we will have a short conversation following by your Q&A. If you don't find the Q&A feature, feel free to send your questions to the email that you got in your confirmation mail for this event, j.ganzer, Ganzer, at jmberlin.de. So I've talked a lot, and I'm very happy to hand over to you, Delphine Orvilleur. The floor is yours.
for being present for this conversation. I hope you hear me well. Let me know if it's not loud enough. I'm aware that it's very difficult to speak today. Many of us are in a state of despair, facing terror and fear, and wondering if we shouldn't simply be silent on that day. But I will try to speak nevertheless. Maybe if you'll allow me, I would like to start and to begin with a very simple remark, what could be called a linguistic observation, if you'll allow me. You're about to follow a conversation, for most of you in English, with a French rabbi who speaks with a large, I guess, German audience about the power of Hebrew. And there's something almost humorous about this, what could be called a linguistic joke, one might say. Perhaps I would say a unique opportunity to become aware that there is nothing more precious in this world than the strength of translation. And the awareness that maybe in order to think, we must always translate between languages, that is, between consciousness. Very often when people around me ask me what is my profession about, what it means to be a rabbi, I often reply that from my point of view, one of the professions and jobs closest to mine is probably that of the translator, because I do indeed spend a lot of time performing translations, journeys between languages, between the language of the text and the language of the world, between Jewish and universal languages, between the sacred of the narrative and the sacredness of life. And I've come to understand, standing by my congregants very often in time of life crisis, that even when we speak the same language, that is, even if the conversation is between two French people or two German people, actually, we always need translation, because most of the time, what one says is not what the other hears. And there's always a kind of distance, inevitable distance between the words of one and the other. And I think that we truly begin to dialogue when we accept how much we don't understand each other. There's a very famous quote by a French author that you might know. His name was Romain Gary. And Romain Gary used to put it this way. He said once, to truly understand each other, we must not speak the same language. And then dialogue can start. So my apologies for this brief introductory aside, but I think it's important for me to start our conversation with this linguistical acknowledgement. Now, let me explain why I chose this text, specifically this one, to speak with you today. For several years, this text, this letter from Gershom Scholem to Rosenzweig, has obsessed me. But recently, I have to say, especially in the past few weeks, and I would say in the past few days, it has become for me almost like a letter that was addressed to me, or at least addressed to our generation. So you may think I'm crazy or paranoid, but it's true. Reading it today, I feel as though it was written exactly 99 years ago, to be read by us today. And I will attempt to explain this feeling. But before that, I must explain its history. And to do so, I must provide a bit of background about the author. So here is the story. The letter that you're about to read, or maybe you read it already, was discovered by chance in 1983. So 1983, it's 1 year after Gershom Scholem's death. The letter was found in Jerusalem, where he used to live. It was tucked inside an old book in the library of this great man, the most renowned scholar of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah in the 20th century. And actually, this letter found in a book is a duplicate of a letter that he sent decades earlier to a very well-known man, Franz Rosenzweig. And the text, found in 1983, was published in 1985, thanks to the work of a great scholar, Stéphane Moses. So it means it was published exactly 40 years ago. As you know, 40 years is a very important time in Jewish thought. It's a very symbolic number in the Jewish tradition, 40 years in the desert. But let's go back and ask in what context it was written and sent, this letter. So the young Gershom Scholem lived and studied in Berlin at the beginning of the 20th century. He belonged to the Berlin Jewish scene and Jewish world, and he was one among many intellectuals at the time, just like Franz Rosenzweig, who reached somehow the same conclusion. Many of them reached the conclusion around the 1920s. They said to themselves something that could be summarized as thus: they considered that Jewish thought and German Jewish life was in a state of clinical death, that it lost its vitality and it stood in a state of maybe hibernation, of boring and sterile bourgeois life. And they considered it was necessary to find a way to regenerate Jewish spirit. So they all agreed pretty much with this diagnosis. They were struggling to promote what we could call maybe today dissimilation. That is, you know, the word is like the opposite of assimilation. The question they faced was, how can we restore for the Jews the feeling and the strength of a full, fulfilled, rich Jewish life when assimilation threatens this? But beyond their observation and their diagnosis, the treatment, if I can use this medical term, the treatment proposed by each of them was not the same. Scholem and Rosenzweig, actually their prescriptions was almost opposite. Everything separates them. Rosenzweig, at the time, advocated for reforming German Jewish life without leaving Europe, whereas Scholem believed that it was hopeless, that it was a lost battle. There was no hope. And hence, he turned to Zionism. And Scholem Zionism could be defined as a spiritual or almost mystical Zionism. And it's not surprising, since he would become the greatest teacher of Kabbalah that the last century has known. He believed that Zionism should enable the Jew to live a profound spiritual fulfillment, to regenerate spirit and spirituality in a political action in the world, in an ethical political action in the world. Be careful. Scholem does not believe that Jews should normalize their status and make Israel a country like the others. You probably remember that Ben-Gurion once said, Ben-Gurion, Israel's prime minister, once said that Israel is a country where there are Jewish thieves and Jewish prostitutes. Well, Scholem believes in a sort of different mission for Zionism. Maybe we'll return to it later. He believes in the possibility for Jews to take political responsibility and take their destiny into their own hands to invent something new. In 1922, Rosenzweig and Scholem, around this question, have a very, very serious dispute. Not a small fight. No. Scholem defines this moment of disagreement as the greatest storm his youth experienced in a confrontation. So they don't speak with each other anymore. And a year later, 1923, Scholem takes a boat to Jerusalem. And the story could end there, I would say, but it continues. Upon arrival, Scholem actively participates in the intellectual world and construction of the country, but quickly, from the very first years of his settlement, he experiences Zionist disappointments. He remains a Zionist throughout his life, but he understands that his recipe of Zionism, his Zionism, is apparently not the one that will prevail in the construction of the state, and he strongly opposes at that time revisionists of Jabotinsky or people from the Mapai party of Ben-Gurion and many others. And in 1926, and this is where we arrived, 1926, 3 years after his arrival in Jerusalem, German colleagues of him offer him to participate in a project on the occasion of Rosenzweig's 40th birthday, while Rosenzweig is already very sick, ill, and can no longer really speak. They propose to Scholem to write a text. And this is the text you have just before you. It's called Confession. It's very evocative title, and it suggests through the title that the man seeks to make a confession to the person he has not spoken to for years. And this is where I think we're ready now to read the text. Ofer, if you would agree, maybe to read part of it or the text itself before we continue.
A confession on the subject of our language. Bekenntnis über unsere Sprache. A letter to Franz Rosenzweig, December 26th, 1926. This country is a volcano. It houses language. One speaks here of many things that could make us fail. One speaks more than ever today about the Arabs, but more uncanny than the Arab people. Another threat confronts us that is a necessary consequence of the Zionist undertaking. What about the actualization of Hebrew? Must not this abyss of a sacred language handed down to our children break out again? Truly, no one knows what is being done here. One believes that language has been secularized, that its apocalyptic thorn has been pulled out. But this is surely not true. The secularization of language is only a façon de parler, a ready-made phrase. It is absolutely impossible to empty out words filled to bursting unless one does so at the expense of language itself. The ghostly Volapük spoken here in the streets points precisely to the expressionless linguistic world in which the secularization of language could alone be possible. If we transmit to our children the language that has been transmitted to us, if we, the generation of transition, resuscitate the language of the ancient books so that it can reveal itself anew to them, must then not the religious violence of this language one day break out against those who speak it? And on the day this eruption occurs, which generation will suffer its effects? We do live inside this language, above an abyss, almost all of us with the certainty of the blind. But when our sight is restored, we or those who come after us, must we not fall to the bottom of this abyss? And no one knows whether the sacrifice of individuals who will be annihilated in this abyss will suffice to close it. The creator of this new linguistic movement believed blindly and stubbornly in the miraculous power of the language, and this was their good fortune. For no one clear-sighted would have mustered the demonic courage to revive a language there where only an Esperanto could emerge. They walk, and walk still today, spellbound above the abyss. The abyss was silent, and they have delivered the ancient names and seals over to the youth. We sometimes shudder when, out of the thoughtless conversation, a word from the religious sphere terrifies us, just there where it was perhaps intended to comfort. Hebrew is pregnant with catastrophes. It cannot and will not remain in its current state. Our children no longer have another language, and it is only too true to say that they, and they alone, will pay for the encounter which we have initiated without asking, without even asking ourselves. If and when the language turns against its speakers, it already does so for certain moments in our lifetime, and these are difficult to forget, stigmatizing moments in which the daring lack of measure of our undertaking reveals itself to us. Will we then have a youth capable of withstanding the uprising of a sacred language? Language is name. In the names, the power of language is enclosed. In them, its abyss is sealed. After invoking the ancient names daily, we can no longer hold off their power. Called awake, they will appear since we have invoked them with great violence. Truly, we speak in rudiments. We speak in rudiments. We truly speak a ghostly language. The names haunt our sentences. One or another plays with them in writings and newspapers, lying to themselves or to God that this means nothing. And often, out of the ghostly shame of our language, the power of the sacred speaks out. For the names have their own life. Had they not, woe to our children who would be hopelessly abandoned to the void. Each word which is not newly created but taken from the good old treasure is full to bursting. a generation that takes upon itself the most fruitful in our sacred traditions. Our language cannot live where it wished it a thousandfold without tradition. The moment the power stored at the bottom of the language deploys itself, the moment the said, das Gesprochene, Hadavar, the content of language assumes its form anew, then the sacred tradition will again confront our people as a decisive sign of the only available choice, to submit or to go under. In a language where He is invoked back to a thousandfold into our life, God will not stay silent. But this inescapable revolution of the language, in which the voice will be heard again, in the sole object of which nothing is said in this country, is the sole object in which nothing is said in this country. Those who called the Hebrew language back to life did not believe in the judgment that was thus conjured upon us. May the carelessness which has led us to this apocalyptic path not bring about our ruin.
Thank you. Thank you for your beautiful reading. So you understand it, that Sholem is absolutely not telling Rosenzweig that he regrets his Zionist move to Jerusalem. This is not the point of his confession. Or he doesn't regret the move, and he doesn't change his belief that the future of the Jewish people is in Israel from his point of view. But he wishes at this moment to share with Rosenzweig a terrible danger of which he is aware, a danger that threatens, according to him, the Jewish society in Palestine in the process of its building. And you'll admit it, it's quite, we know with an historical insight, it's quite disturbing or counterintuitive to think that this letter is written 7 years before Hitler's rise to power, and a Jew in Palestine is writing to a Jew in Germany that is aware of the danger that threatens him. The danger Sholem identifies is fascinating because it's not political. Sholem advocates at the time very strongly for dialogue with the Arabs of Palestine. He's part of a group called Brit Shalom, Peaceful Alliance. But the danger he refers to is of another kind. It's a linguistic one, a linguistic threat. Sholem acknowledges the danger facing a population that has secularized or normalized the Hebrew language, and that might seem totally absurd since when a language is dangerous, since when a language can become threatening. But yet, he has the conviction, this is the conviction of a man who dedicated his life to language. Sholem will be the leading expert of Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, a mysticism of word and language and letters. And indeed, according to him and the Kabbalist, I might say, words create universe and realities, including political realities. And he believes that one cannot use words without their religious depth, without in a way reactivating a kind of apocalypse, as if using them could trigger a seismic movement like a volcano, and that's the image he uses, whose activity is fueled by language until the lava erupts and engulfs us. To understand what he means, you have to consider maybe 1 second an experience that I'm sure many of you have had, especially if you visited Israel and if you have some knowledge in Hebrew. One of my rabbis and teachers, Marc Alain Waknin, beautifully told me once this story. He said that one day he was taking a cab in Israel, a taxi, and he was stuck when the driver asked him at the end of the ride, "Ata rotze Kabbalah? Do you want a Kabbalah?" Well, in modern Hebrew, Kabbalah means simply a receipt or a bill. But of course, it's the same word as Kabbalah. Kabbalah, the name of the Jewish mysticism, a tradition that is received and passed down from generation to generation. So for a moment, my teacher, my rabbi, thought that the taxi driver was offering him a lesson of Kabbalah. And such misunderstandings are numerous in Hebrew. Why? Because many words in Hebrew have what we call polysemy. They can be understood in a sacred way or in a profane way. we use words from the prayer books, but in everyday life. And this transposition raises questions. For example, I could give you many examples, but for example, when early Zionists started to purchase lands from Palestinian farmers to establish settlements, they called the process Geulat HaKarka, which means in Hebrew, redemption of the land. So it can be translated in a profane way, like real estate transaction, but the true meaning of the term is entirely messianic. It refers to Geula, to the redemption of the land. Another example, very meaningful today, in the temple at the time in Jerusalem, the priest used to wear a glorious garment to officiate, and the garment he was wearing was called ephod, which means breastplate in biblical Hebrew. But interestingly, this very term is used to call today the protective vest worn by Israeli soldiers on their uniform, a kind of bulletproof vest for their chest. So it's a coincidence? No, it's not a coincidence. It suggests somehow that the military activity of soldiers in Israel has something to do with a sacred function. And there are many, many other examples, all aligned with Sholem's reflection. How can we know for sure if the use of a sacred language, mystical imagery, messianic elements from tradition can be secularized and normalized without impacting society? Sholem, 100 years ago, is convinced that it's impossible. Maybe because he's a believing man. He believes, as he states in the text, that when you speak this language, when you secularize the language, you create what he calls a messianic bomb that will explode one day, and future generations might be victims. And he wonders, will they have the tools and the religious culture to master this language? From his perspective, it's as if, and you read it beautifully, as if those words could whistle or summon God's presence in the world. So potentially God will come back and will demand accountability, and there will be a time of judgment, and possibly future generation will have to stand in this judgment. So I'm aware that many people maybe listen to this text today, and maybe they consider that this text is not rational at all. It's too mystical, weird, also magical thinking. But personally, as rational as I am, I can't help but think how Sholem's confession is actually of rare relevance and accuracy. And in my view, it truly has something very prophetic. And some days, I think that if I can use Sholem's word, the Jewish linguistic bomb has indeed exploded, and we are the generation that has to face it. I thought about it, to be honest, for many years. I thought about it 30 years ago, precisely in 1995, when at the time I was living in Israel, and I found myself one evening on a square in Tel Aviv at the moment when a prime minister was assassinated. And it then seemed to me that the killer's motivations, his absolute conviction to act in the name of the divine will, and his messianic political drive reflected Sholem's warning. And 30 years have passed. And here we are again. I observe that the Zionist messianic drive, the very one that Sholem denounced as dangerous and catastrophic for Zionism, is actually now in power, and it's represented by some ministers in a government who call for waging wars against Amalek and maybe having Gog and Magog battle against enemies that they often liken to inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah, or the fact that Amalek should be annihilated. And I question Sholem's warning, and I questioned its relevance for our generation and our reflection today. Are we sure that we are not the generation for whom the messianic volcano has erupted? Are we sure it will not engulf us? That's the question I pose today. And this question, as you can imagine, is not liked by everyone. And obviously this question bothers a lot of people who try to shut me down and to shut other people down. But I'm convinced it's the conversation we must have. We always had in the Jewish people important and sometimes difficult conversations among people who don't agree. But if we fail to allow this conversation and to warn new generations about what might threaten them, then I believe that our generation will be morally tainted. And we will carry that responsibility. And that's why, and I will conclude this way, that's why, in my view, and based on Gershom Scholem's text, it's essential today to have this conversation in all languages possible and without delay.
Thank you so much, Delphine Orvilleur, for these inspiring words. And I don't know where to begin, actually. Maybe I will start at the end. That indeed, a few days ago, I was asked in an interview about what is going on in Israel right now, the country in which I live, from which I speak now. Why is the name of the current operation the Chariots of Gideon? What does it mean that it is called the Chariots of Gideon, referring to Amalek, as you have just mentioned? And I would also like to touch upon the point of translation that you have mentioned. Translation as a possible rescue, as a possible way out of dead ends. Hannah Arendt also talks about translation as a possibility of escaping dead ends. There is a beautiful text from Marie-Louise Knott exactly about this point, that translation allows us sometimes to maybe to escape the prophecy that you have brought to us today with these texts. Actually, my first question that I intended to pose you was, you know, the Hebrew language is pregnant with catastrophe. So did you bring us today a question, an answer, or a prophecy, a warning? And I think, by the way, it is a warning that Gershom Scholem himself already saw its fulfillment in his own lifetime. He wrote, when he wrote From Berlin to Jerusalem, he writes the following sentence. When I read letters, I quote, "When I read letters I wrote 60 years ago in Hebrew, I laugh and cry at the same time. I laugh for the progress our language has made, and I cry for the price of this progress." So it means that already way later he saw at least the fulfillment of this prophecy. But let's go a few steps back, because Gershom Scholem, you know, says that the important contribution of Judaism to the history of language was the sense that language is creation. That first there is God, and then there is God's name, and then the outspoken word, which is the moment of creation. And indeed, when we this Zionistic act of reviving the Hebrew language, you know, making it alive again, that the revival of the language is the revival of the nation language as a moment of genesis, of creation. And you talked about this bomb. There is a beautiful correspondence between Nathan Schneider and Doron Rabinovich, where Nathan Schneider writes, Zionism is pregnant with Zion. And we can take this, you know, further on, this duality between a symbol and a place, between the land of Israel and the state of Israel. And we can see how Zionism tries to object in a way, to push away this notion. I mean, this letter that you have brought us was written 1926, a year before the Hebrew University of Jerusalem was opened on Mount Scopus, away from the Temple Mount, away from the Mount Moriah, was referred to also as a new temple, trying to overcome or to escape the root, the prophecy of the religious tension of Hebrew. Obviously with not such great success. So my question to you, after this long little speech of mine, my question to you, you offer in your book, for instance, Yiddish as a language that can overcome this determination. Scholem himself talks about Esperanto in the text that you've brought us today. And actually you start your book as well with a beautiful poem by Mahmoud Darwish in Arabic, or translated from Arabic. So is translation, is poetry, is Yiddish, is Esperanto a possible answer to overcome this prophecy?
Well, this is a great question. I hope we have a few hours now to
Me too.
to answer.
I'll just say yes.
I would like to address the question of prophecy. You know, I thought a lot about this in the past days as a rabbinic question for my leadership, for my rabbinate. You know, I'm aware of for the past year and a half, especially, I mean, for the past years, but especially for the past year and a half, since October 7th, I found myself in the front line of in the media and writing articles and books about Israel and the trauma of October 7th and defending Israel, and very often its narrative. And in many ways, I placed myself, or I was put in a position to be, if I might use words of biblical leadership, to be in a position of priesthood. You know, the priest is the one who reunites the people. The priest wears beautiful clothes, you know, he has a specific ritual role, and the people come to him and expect him to speak and to act in their name. And unfortunately, I say unfortunately because I never asked to be in that position. People placed me in this position of priesthood. And I realized when I wrote the text last week that created so much reaction in the Jewish community, when I invited Israel out of love of Zionism, I said that I think diaspora today needs to help Israel look at itself in the mirror out of Zionism and out of love of Zion. I realized that suddenly I had stepped out of my priest position to step into a prophetic position. But of course, I will invite you to put a lot of ding ding, you know, around this word. I'm definitely not a prophet, but I think that I tried to be faithful to a certain prophetic tradition that is very dear to Jewish tradition, and it's a call for justice. And the problem is that if you read the Bible, you know it pretty fast. No one likes prophets because it's very annoying. You know, who wants to listen to prophetic voices? You know, those are always people who you know mess with the, you know, with the party. Like they come and tell you maybe you're wrong, maybe you misbehave. Think about justice. Go back to the right place. And so I experienced and I felt in the past days that actually it has a very high cost to step into, you know, to be faithful to a certain prophetic tradition, or to remain faithful to this question of the, you know, offering a mirror. One of the reasons why also I decided to talk is precisely because of what you mentioned now. I believe we are experiencing, all of us, a time of failure of language. And it's very difficult not to notice around us how people fail to speak and to talk and to find the right words. And I'm sure it's true it's true in Israel, it's true in Germany, it's true in Europe, it's true in France. People tend, in time of crisis and war, one of the effects of the war is that you speak only with slogans. You know, people use what we call in Hebrew sismaot, slogans. We don't have a clue what those slogans means. You know, the best slogan now in Israel that can't be interpreted is this word Yachad Nenetzeach, that the entire nation is saying together we will win, but no one knows exactly what this together imply. Together with whom? And we will win, but we will win what? What would be truly a victory? And it's true in Israel, but it's true everywhere, and definitely it's true in Europe and America. People use words and have no ideas nowadays what they mean through these words. You know, I could give you 1,000 examples, but the strongest word on this matter is Zionist or anti-Zionist. When people say I'm anti-Zionist, most of the time in a conversation with those people, I stop the conversation and I ask them, what do you mean? And most of the time, people are totally unable to tell me what they mean, because sometimes they mean that they are critical of the policy of the Israeli government, which would then, if it was the definition of anti-Zionism, would place many, many Israelis under that definition, many rabbis, many Jews. I mean, obviously, this is not the definition of the world. Or I don't know, you never know exactly what people mean because we are in a state of failure to express ourselves. And I see it myself. You know, recently a journalist on the French national radio asked me a question I didn't expect. She told me that my last book, the book that was released also in Germany, is called in French Comment ça va pas, which means how isn't it going? And obviously in French, the sentence is not right grammatically, doesn't fit. So she said, well, your last book was called How Isn't It Going? And the new book I released last month in France is called That's the title of the book. And she said, you know, it's worse and worse. I guess your next book is going to be because what actually she helped me understood is that the very title of my book echoes the fact that I myself lost language. I lost words. And it's my work as a rabbi, you know, to work around meanings and interpretation. But I feel kind of lost because I don't know anymore how to find the right language. And this is where Sholem's reflection, the Kabbalah, comes also into this consideration, because as you said, if the Jewish mysticism teaches us something, it's the fact that words and language have the power to create or to annihilate a universe. Genesis is built around the idea that the action of creation, Bria in Hebrew, is made by Vayomer, by the fact that God speaks and the world comes to be. And in the same way, with words, we know it, the rabbis call it cherev pipiot. They say that with their words, they have like a knife into their mouth. They can kill with words. They're all aware of that. So we're in this position where there is a fragility or an inability or a failure of language. And what can we do? So I'll tell you what I do. And actually, you got the answer because you presented perfectly. The only thing that I can do is turn to poetry. Right now, this is really the thing that helps me. And this is the reason why I place those poems at the beginning, at the end of my last book. It may sound like, you know, a bit unrealistic, but I believe that there is no one better than poets who understand and teach that you can use words differently, that you can play with language and create like a broderie, new meanings that might change your view. You know, when you find the right word, suddenly you're back to yourself. You're back to your plain and full humanity. With words, suddenly you're able to have, again, empathy for the other. War annihilates empathy for the other, but back to language, back to poetry, we managed to find a way back, I believe, to our humanity. And the last thing I would say to answer your question, you spoke about Yiddish. I speak about Yiddish in my book because I think that Yiddish is the absolute example of a language that is a mixture of other language. You know, when you speak Yiddish, you have to take pieces from Russian and German and Hebrew and other languages, and you build like this mismatch of this rich combination of consciousness and worlds come together into Yiddish. And I think also that Yiddish has been spoken by people who were aware all along their history of their fragility, of how much we are broken, totally broken. So in my book, I said with humor, but actually I might be quite serious, that I think today we are so broken that maybe each and every one of us should only speak Yiddish.
Well, I would definitely applaud to that. And for those who are listening now, if you were not persuaded by now, I would heartily recommend you this book, which indeed ends with a poem by Yehuda Amichai, if I'm not mistaken. A beautiful poem by Yehuda Amichai. By the way, I forgot another very important detail, that Delphine Orvilleur got the prize of Understanding Intolerance of the Jewish Museum in Berlin, and I think we get a perfect example why. And before I ask yet another question, I would remind you, the audience, that you have the possibility to pose your questions either in the Q&A function or via an email to the address that I've already given you, that also appears in the confirmation mail that you got for your participation in this event. Delphine, I wanted to ask you now a question about the generations, because you said that our generation perhaps is the generation that that experiences the fulfillment of this prophecy, the eruption of the sacred bomb, of the sacred load of the Hebrew language. And Sholem refers to himself and to Franz Rosenzweig actually as the generation of transition. And, you know, when he describes his father or his grandfather, again from Berlin to Jerusalem, he talks about his grandfather as being a great fan of Richard Wagner. He called himself Siegfried. By the way, interestingly enough, in his grave in Berlin in Weißensee, the Hebrew caption says Shalom Shalom as his name, foreign last name Shalom Shalom, but the German one is Siegfried Shalom, so his German name. And now when we talk, I go fast forward beyond this generation of transition to our own generation. I think one of the main experiences that was made by many people following October 7th, and also in the face of the war that we see these days in Israel and in the Gaza Strip, that you have a feeling that the generations collapse into each other. You know, we used to, or people used to, especially in Europe or in Jewish thought in the 21st century, to count the generation. Are you first generation, second generation, third generation, referring, of course, to the war? And all of a sudden, we are confronted with pictures that a friend referred to it. These are as if pictures that we used to know in black and white gain color all of a sudden.
Mm.
And in a way, Gershom Scholem tries to pose himself and Franz Rosenzweig as a barrier that should have, as the generation of transition, that should have served as a wall, separating or stopping this load, this sacred load of Hebrew from erupting to their children, to the future generation, to us. And here we are finding ourselves collapsing back the trail of generations, back to the Jewish history. So is it in a way, if we read this text today, if we see that the huge clock of generations points at zero again, so in a way, are we doomed in the way that every Jewish generation is doomed to not be able to stop this messianic load, to stop this sacred load of the Hebrew language from erupting?
Very interesting question. You know, listening to you, I'm thinking, I'm leaving aside one second the Middle East and Jewish crisis we're going through. I've been thinking a lot in recent years about how much our generation is stuck with intergenerational tensions. One might say that it always happened, you know, that each generation somehow believes that the older generation is stupid, like okay boomer, you know, and each generation maybe in the past believed that the young generation is stupid and they don't understand everything. You know, it's a classical intergenerational tension. But I believe that there is something stronger in our generation, that actually for the past years we have witnessed in the political realm a lot of super powerful tensions between generations, that, you know, it was maybe embodied among other examples, that the fact that people wanted to uproot statutes and of people, to burn books, to denunciate, you know, past, to do a kind of tabula rasa, to get rid of the past, to reinvent history and to reinvent language and to reinvent ourselves out of any determination. And I think it has been a very powerful and sometimes threatening, impossible conversation that we witnessed in the past years. So just like you, I wonder, and I don't know exactly what Scholem means when he speaks about himself as a generation of transition, because you could interpret this as being the generation of Zionists who arrive in the country and make the move, like the geographical move. But I believe he means something else. And my guess is that, again, it has something to do with languages. When I was a child, if you would have asked me what defines a Jewish family, my diasporic Jewish family, I would probably, with my child mind, I would have said that what defines my family is that we constantly speak many languages. My grandparents spoke at least, I don't know, 5, 6, or 7 languages. They came from Eastern Europe. And I'm sure, like many people who listen to us now, they have the same experience, that their grandparents spoke Hungarian and Roman and Yiddish and Russian. And it was part of the ethos of the Jewish family that we were able to speak many languages and to move in between those influences. I don't know, and I think that partly this is what Sholem means. I think he's concerned that with the revival of the Hebrew and the secularization and normalization of Hebrew, we might create generations of Jews who are monolinguistic. And it partly happened in Israel. You know, people speak English, obviously, but very few people speak Arabic. Hebrew is the language that unites what we call kibbutz galuyot, like the people come together around the Hebrew. And I think that Sholem is aware that actually it's quite a strong handicap in life when you speak only one language. You know, it's the introduction I gave to my speech today. I feel that Jews are really aware, and they have been reminded this all along history, that very often their survival has depended upon their ability to speak many languages, not simply, you know, linguistic, but also, you know, this ability to travel in between worlds, you know. And maybe what Sholem is talking about has to do with it. What I see today is that we are definitely not helped, and it's a euphemism. I think we are also in big linguistic trouble because of social media. Also, I think that our generation now developed a modality of conversation that is totally that cancel every possibility of nuance, cancel possibilities of complexity, strengthens the fact that we speak only with slogans and very few words, and only with people who agree with us. And actually, you know, again, we are back into the questions of the language. If you have only one language and if it's impoverished by your culture, if you restrain the number of words you use, then there is no way your thought and your political thought will be complex and subtle enough to envision new possibilities, new political possibilities. And actually, when you restrain language, you restrain imagination. And this is where we stand. I'm very often struck when I take part in conversations with Israelis and Palestinians that actually what they miss the most today is imagination. You know, there is no room to figure out, to imaginate another possible future right now.
Thank you for.
I'm sorry to be so depressing. Maybe
but, yeah, well, these are difficult times. Although, you know, I think that the moment that you conduct a conversation, I always, you know, when people talk about despair, you started actually your words between, you put these two beautiful, you know, desperation and translation as two poles. This is how you started. I emphasized it to myself. So I think indeed the translation, moving between worlds and cultures, is definitely an act against desperation. And I quote a good friend who has lost both parents on October 7th and has fought ever since against the war and for understanding, Mao Zedong, who says that hope is not something you have, hope is something you do. And I think that by conducting such conversations and speaking up, this is doing hope and not only waiting that hope will come upon us. So regarding again translation and the sacred load of language, when Israel after 1967, we talked about Mount Scopus, about Gershom Scholem, and about the Hebrew University. When Israel conquered, liberated, you know, it depends who you ask, East Jerusalem and the West Bank. So there was a festive concert in the amphitheater of Har HaTzofim, of Mount Scopus, featuring the Israel Philharmonic Orchestra playing, if I remember correctly, Beethoven 9th Symphony. And actually Beethoven 9th Symphony was played in Israel for years in English, in order not to invoke the voice, the sound of German in Israel, because it was unconceivable that the actually beautiful words of Sheila, who say every human should be brother, alle Menschen werden Brüder, that this will sound in German. And speaking about translation today, actually today the computer translates for us, the AI, but by this we lose indeed the maybe embarrassment that we sometimes experience when we try to translate our thoughts, but again, an embarrassment which helps us to escape dead ends that that language poses us sometimes. I see now a question from the audience. I would read it aloud. The phenomenon of language of the youth who are creating new words and often change the sense and take words from different languages. Do you think this is to do with the fragility from which we all suffer? This is a question that I see that come from the audience. Maybe you want to refer to that.
Well, it's fascinating. I noticed this with my teenagers here at home. I have 3 kids. And indeed, they invent a lot of words. I guess we all did that. You know, in my generation in France, when I was their age, we used to speak in what we call in French verlan. Verlan is a way to inverse a syllable. Like, I don't know, if you want to say maison, you say zonmé. Like, so it was our way to shift languages. And I think each generation does that. But it became stronger and stronger. Now, my children are indeed inventing or using so many words that I don't understand and have nothing to do with French syllables also. And they think that there's nothing more funny than to speak things that I will not understand. And I think indeed it teaches us something like an attempt to, if each generation needs to invent in a way to twist the language, each generation twists the language he inherited. I'm a bit concerned when this play on words and language is not anymore a twist, but the idea that you can get rid of the past. That suddenly you imagine that you can invent a language out of nothing. This seems to me quite dangerous, because I think the question that is asked for each and every one of us all along our life is the question of heritage. How are we truly, faithfully heirs to past generations? And the answer, we know it philosophically, is that true and faithful heirs are always partly unfaithful. The example that I give is the example of grandmother's soup recipes. The only way a family can remember the recipe of their grandparents' soup is only if they say, I do my grandmother's soup, but I changed a little spice. I add some salt, or I put some cumin or whatever. I think very often faithfulness in a family is partially unfaithfulness. I think the question of being faithful or unfaithful has a lot to do with the question of language also. And you were addressing the question of 67, and I think indeed this is a turning point in the conversation we have about the heritage of Gershom Scholem. I think something changed in Israel history in 67 with the victory. That suddenly a language of messianic victory developed. And we see today, 50 years later, what is the impact of this switch in language and metaphors when we start talking about miracle and messianic victory. So then we are, I think we are in, we are part of we are taking part in Sholem's prophecy.
You know, I saw your questions in the chat regarding how neutral a translator should be, and talking actually about the political will in Israel to secularize language, indeed. But then again, and I think this is the most enigmatic sentence in this whole letter that you have brought us, because Scholem also says that if the names, the language would not have their own life, then he writes, woe to our children who would be hopelessly abandoned to the void. So he is against, rejecting completely this this load of language. And maybe we should also remember that Gershom Scholem, after 1945, was sent to Europe to rescue Otzrot HaGola, the treasures of a diaspora, where he met Hannah Arendt, by the way, doing the same thing. So rescuing Hebrew books, rescuing religious books, rescuing Jewish libraries, and understanding that the books, the language, is also a place that people gather around in order to create a collectivity, a Jewish collectivity, a new Jewish collectivity. So this enigmatic sentence of he does not reject completely. He also says that we need to have this, words have to have their own life, because without this life, we will be lost. He says that our children will be hopelessly abandoned to the void. Dramatic words.
Yeah, I think. Do you hear me now? It's okay. Yeah.
Yes,
I think. I think what he means is, I mean, there should be no misunderstanding. He's not saying that we should stop speaking Hebrew. I think he believes in Hebrew and the power of Hebrew, but I think he wants to make sure that the tools will be given to new generations to know the power of those Hebrew words. So what he means is that he believes that we cannot leave new generations in the void of knowledge, in the void of Jewish knowledge, because the only way you can master the language is if you know all the stratification of this language is concerned, not that people will use these words, but that people will use these words without knowing their multiple meanings. So I think he's engaging the new generation, because he was also an educator. I think he's, in his writing, he's so concerned about education and Jewish knowledge and Jewish treasure and Jewish library. So I think he wants to make sure that the new generation will be aware that in this attempt to secularize and to speak a normal language in an everyday life, you should never, never forget what is the power that is hidden behind each word. And you can do this only through literacy, through knowledge, through Hebrew culture. So I think it's quite a beautiful invitation. I don't know if we've been up to the challenge. Frankly, I don't know. Sometimes I doubt it. Also, you just mentioned Hannah Arendt, and I want to say a word about that, because when people think of Gershom Scholem, very often one of the conversation that comes very fast, or one of the references, is famous interaction with Hannah Arendt around Eichmann trial, when he accused Hannah Arendt of missing what he called Ahavat Israel. He said that he disagreed with the conclusions she reached in the trial against Eichmann, because he thinks that she lacks love of the people of Israel, Ahavat Israel. And I think a lot also about this conversation today, and I think it's pretty clear why we must think about this conversation, because when people like me and others today announce criticism of Israeli politics or policy, even though they're Israeli, I mean, I'm French and Israeli, and I lived in Israel many years, very, very fast, the criticism that comes in the conversation is that people tell you, you lack, in a way, I mean, they don't use that word, but this is what they mean. They say you lack Ahavat Israel. And I think exactly the opposite, but it's very difficult to convince people about that. I think that precisely what enables me today to speak is my Ahavat Israel. I mean, it's an ahava, it's a love that I cannot question, because that is deeply, profoundly what builds me, what builds my intellectual life, my spiritual life. I'm deeply connected to this literary heritage, to this tradition, to my people, to this language, and to Hebrew. And because I feel that inside me, that my Ahavat Israel is never questioned, it gives me the power, I think, to be able to bring this conversation forward. So I think we should be aware in the Jewish world today, when we speak, even when we totally disagree, that we should always act with a consciousness of this Ahavat Israel. Ahavat Israel, not in the meaning of Israel, the country, but very often Israel as the Jewish people, and the, what is called in the Bible Am Israel, the people of Israel. And this is where always the conversation should start.
So I think what can be actually a more fitting ending to our conversation than talking about Ahavat Israel that Gershom Scholem wrote about, or the lack of it that he wrote about to Hannah Arendt. Dear Delphine Orvilleur, thank you for your words tonight. Thank you for your words in general. Thank you for your books, which I highly recommend. I saw a question here in the chat, which books of Delphine Orvilleur are available in English? Several. I invite you to go and look for them. Also, as I said before, in German, of course, in Hebrew, and in many different languages. Thank you for your participation. Thank you again for the staff of the Jewish Museum in Berlin, the Academy. Thank you, dear audience, for being here and listening. I invite you for our next lecture with Moshe Sakal in about a month's time. And until then, especially in these days, stay safe. And if to follow Delphine Orvilleur's words from her beautiful article, do not be silent. Thank you very much. Have a good evening. Schönen guten Abend. And I will see you next time. Goodbye.
Thank you.